In the dialogue where Socrates refuses to escape his death sentence, the laws of Athens are given a voice and speak to him, urging him not to flee. He imagines them reminding him that under their protection he was born and raised, and that throughout his life they safeguarded him. For this reason, it would be wrong to abandon them now simply because they have turned against him on this occasion. He has benefited from their protection and must now endure their severity. His duty is to fulfill his side of the agreement and accept his fate with composure. This passage assumes the existence of an agreement between Socrates and the laws, binding even in matters of life and death. The possibly unjust nature of the verdict does not weaken this bond. Socrates does not treat that injustice as relevant. Even though his defense showed the weakness of his accuser's arguments, the decision of the city remains, for him, the voice of Athens, which cannot be set aside. The relationship between Socrates as an individual and his city is thus portrayed as unequal, and the harshness of this bond is scarcely softened by his calm acceptance. The idea of a contract with the laws is further emphasized by the dream he recounts before his conversation with Crito, in which a woman dressed in white tells him that within 3 days he will depart for fertile Phthia. Both the dream and the imagined speech of the laws raise the question of whether Plato took social contract theory seriously as a way of describing the individual's relation to society. For the Socrates of this dialogue, the agreement with the laws existed even before his birth. The not yet existent Socrates, and later the embryo destined to become him, were already bound to the laws of Athens. This idea recalls the notion of beings addressed and held accountable before they come into existence. The implication is that the contract reaches into the realm of the unborn, hinting at a connection between this concept and Platonic or Pythagorean views of repeated rebirth, where actions in earlier lives determine the conditions of later ones. The contract Socrates imagines with the laws can be extended to a broader understanding of natural and cosmic order. His pact was less with the traditional gods who were thought to guarantee the institutions of the city, and more with the deeper order of nature itself. It was precisely these gods that his enemies accused him of disregarding by introducing new divinities. Yet the laws that spoke to him may be compared to the guardians who preserve the stability of the ideal society described in the Republic, a society that can be seen as a development of the contractual vision suggested here. In the Republic, Socrates has advanced beyond the role of a loyal citizen of a democracy, even though its dramatic setting predates the Crito. But in the Crito itself, he shows a readiness to accept the voice of the laws as truth, even though they belong to a weakened and recently restored regime. His concern is not with the faults of the political order into which fate and the gods had placed him, but with the deeper question of what he and others meant when they used words. He is an inward man, following the oracle's injunction to know himself. His relation to the city was therefore more personal than that of most Greeks. One might compare it to the relationship between parent and child. This is fitting, since in dreams the personifications of laws, concepts, or ancestors often appeared in parent-like forms, larger than life, beautiful, admonishing, yet at the same time protective and reassuring. It is not simple to apply the modern distinction between a governmental contract and a social contract to the ancient world. Socrates' imagined agreement with the laws of Athens suggests something like a governmental contract, but it carries a metaphysical dimension because the laws appear as dream figures, and the whole structure rests partly in the city and partly in the heavens. The fact that the contract only becomes explicit within the dream evokes a comparison with the agraphoi nomoi, the unwritten laws that govern behavior between individuals and cities in Greece. Being fundamental and unspoken, the laws in the Crito seem to represent both the social and governmental contract, which is nearly inevitable in societies where the state and society cannot be clearly separated. Yet the influence of the agraphoi nomoi suggests that, as Barker argues, a contract need not be explicit to be valid. The social contract exists outside time, and it is unnecessary to ask when it came into being, except perhaps for rhetorical illustration. It may even be conceived as an implied agreement about behavior patterns, independent of temporal constraints. Plato, however, offers in the laws a clear instance of a governmental contract, said to have been concluded in ancient times by the Dorians who invaded the Peloponnese. This agreement was explicit. The kings swore not to make the laws harsher, and the people swore not to subvert society or permit others to do so. Such a contract may reflect a careful restoration of law and order in a society torn by civil strife. An example is Sparta, whose law and order were established around the 7th century before the Common Era. Yet these mutual oaths to preserve stability may trace back even further, to the act of conquest itself, when followers of the invading kings were granted lands and bound in loyalty. In this sense, the agreement is less a governmental contract and more a means of regulating the orderly occupation of territory. Some scholars suggest that Plato is hostile to the idea of social contract, disliking the theory that society rests merely on an agreement that certain things exist and must be obeyed. Yet in the Republic, he demonstrates that it is not agreement itself that he rejects. The proto-society of skilled craftsmen he describes is not founded on arbitrary consensus, but on the recognition that natural gifts vary and specializations arise to avoid wasting time and expertise. Plato's concern is not with contracts per se, but with the principles underlying them. When the components of an agreement are arranged in accordance with a true understanding of human nature, Plato accepts and even endorses such contracts. Plato did not approve of the contractarian ideas put forward by the generation of sophists that preceded him. Their theories held that nomos, custom, law, or convention, rather than physis, nature, was the foundation of social institutions. Their thinking reflected a knowledge of many different cities and diverse ways of understanding the relation of man to society. This relativism carried a hint of nihilism that deeply unsettled Plato, so that when he introduces their views in his dialogues, he treats them firmly, though with respect, and offers careful rebuttals. The sophists' conventionalism is sometimes, paradoxically, combined with an appeal to a superficial naturalism. Thrasymachus claims that justice is merely the advantage of the stronger, and that the rules of civilization arise from the protests of the weak against those more powerful. Callicles in the Gorgias advances similar ideas, showing a grim sympathy with raw power. Plato's Socrates skillfully exposes the emptiness of such a will to power as a political principle. For Plato, nomos must be grounded in truth, not merely asserted. This was the kind of law he envisioned for his ideal societies. It was not a natural law in the modern sense derived from Hellenic and Hellenistic unwritten law or the Roman ius gentium, but it was not entirely unrelated, and throughout the Republic, an accurate understanding of human nature is consistently presented as the only just foundation for society. Plato shared the sophists' recognition of man's aggressiveness, but in the Republic this tendency is channeled into the defense of the city, both from internal and external enemies, through emphasis on the spirited and courageous element within the epikuroi phylax. The spirited, thymodes, reflects a trace of naturalism and is a term commonly applied to horses. The epikuroi are likened to dogs, trained to protect without harming the flocks. The contrast between nomos and physis is made sharply, though not always clearly, in Antiphon's fragmentary essay on truth. This contrast is directly linked to the contractarian idea of society, which may have been familiar to Plato. The essay addresses the individual's relation to society, arguing that a person should not violate the laws of the city. Justice consists in obedience, but this is only meaningful when there are witnesses to observe transgressions. If no one is present, a person may act as they wish. This reflects a sophisticated shame culture, reminiscent of the volatile personalities of Homeric heroes. The claims of inner nature, which Socrates championed, are either absent in Antiphon or deliberately rejected. Socrates was not the first to examine the self. This inward search is visible in Aeschylus' struggles with traditional conceptions of the gods, and a form of guilt culture can be traced in the constrained, agrarian world depicted in Hesiod. Antiphon and Homer recognized the dark and wicked tendencies in human nature, but accepted them with aristocratic calm. Aeschylus, Socrates, Plato, and the tragically minded Euripides, however, were troubled by what they perceived. Socrates, in particular, stands out as one profoundly disturbed by the emptiness he found when he looked inward. Antiphon maintains that laws are imposed on men from outside, while human nature obeys the dictates of necessity unless forced otherwise. The laws imposed upon men are called by him things agreed upon, and are contrasted with things that have grown by nature. The latter carry a sense of natural growth, akin to the vegetable world. If a man violates the ordinances of things grown by nature, he will suffer the consequences, whether or not his fellow men notice, for he has defied nature itself, not merely human convention. Pentheus in Euripides' Bacchae, for example, suffers death because he aligns himself too closely with the mere agreed laws of Thebes and disregards the greater power of nature, as embodied by Dionysus. The distinction between physis and nomos emphasizes the supremacy of nature over human institutions and, in a sense, celebrates the primitive. Certain aspects of Antiphon's thesis thus evoke the Homeric temper and the positions attributed to other sophists. Antiphon implies that the individual citizen has a stronger contract with himself and his own nature than with society. Human nature asserts itself whenever possible, but compromises with agreed laws in order to survive and perhaps transgress them again. This position is flexible, reminiscent of Odysseus. A man familiar with many cities and minds will conform to multiple codes, or write about them with detached curiosity, like Xenophanes or Herodotus. Antiphon belongs to the world of Greek wanderers, whereas Plato represents the settled, a collector of fragments after the disasters of the Peloponnesian War, a 4th-century writer of constitutions. His social theory leaves little room for gifted wanderers. Antiphon's essay can be seen as challenging the rule of law and advocating individualism. 5th-century Greek contractarians display a heroic, archaic individualism, and it is reasonable to think that Antiphon shared this tendency. Though his work survives only in fragments, there are indications of a keen observer of human behavior, deeply experienced, and perhaps bitterly so, in politics. Such a character, in the Homeric sense, must be adept, Odyssean in ability, able to adjust policy and personality to the prevailing laws and to anticipate changes during crises. Plato knew this type well. Callicles in the Gorgias exemplifies it, and Thrasymachus in the Republic represents another theorist of this school. Intellectual skill is required to appear virtuous for expediency or survival. In stasis, as Thucydides vividly describes at Corcyra during the Peloponnesian War, the meanings of words and acts shift rapidly. An Odyssean individualist must act swiftly to survive. In such turmoil, the many men and many cities of Homer exist within a single city. Both the pragmatic individualist and the genuinely law-abiding Socratic figure are at risk, as Socrates himself was in the legalized stasis of the restored democracy. Plato's solution is to remove the causes of stasis by establishing a society where rulers know the good and can enact it, allowing philosophy to supersede mere laws. Aristoxenus suggested that much of the Republic draws upon Protagoras of Abdera. Plato's Protagoras presents the myth that man was originally given, by Zeus, the faculty to live in groups for mutual protection, as individuals alone were ill-equipped for defense. In this sense, Protagoras presents a social contract grounded in the natural limitations and weaknesses of human beings. This parallels the Republic's arrangement of expert craftsmen who, through specialization, compensate for one another's individual shortcomings. In Protagoras' scheme, the capacity for group living is presented as a broadly distributed human trait, and little attention is given to specialized skill in governing, which occupies much of Plato's thought on man and society. Protagoras emphasizes the socially conformable character of humans, which enables them to suppress individuality enough to make group life possible. The ability for orderly social existence is considered innate, belonging to a politically capable species, rather than a monopoly of rare and highly trained philosophers. This forms the mythological foundation for Greek democracy, where all men participate actively in government, focusing on commonalities rather than differences. Though the Socrates of the dialogue rejects Protagoras' myth and its implications, he does not entirely dismiss it as absurd. Protagoras suggests that man's covenant is with a nature given by Zeus, while the Republic maintains that society should be organized on naturally defined principles, and those suited by nature to rule should govern. In the Crito, Socrates' covenant is with the laws that reside in his heart, yet are in some sense transcendent. Across these three works, nature and convention are not opposed, nor fully fused into what we might call natural law. They remain sufficiently distinct for Plato to envision the individual as having a personal relation to society, as if a private contract. While this idea becomes more rigorously framed as Plato's thought develops toward the laws, it remains a persistent reminder of the original Socratic theme. Plato's views on survival after death and the immortality of the soul remain debated in detail, but it is clear that he seriously affirmed the immortality of the psyche. Even though much of his description of the afterworld is poetic and metaphorical, the psyche participates in the essential nature of life and cannot admit death. It is a source of motion itself, always affecting movement, incapable of destruction or cessation. These theories of immortality are supported by dialectical reasoning rather than myth, and Plato retained his conviction regarding motion throughout his life. Yet in the eschatologies of the Phaedo, Phaedrus, and Republic, the individual soul after death remains recognizably human, retaining its emotional and desiring aspects rather than being reduced to a purely rational core. Death does not terminate individual existence or consciousness. These continue in another mode. The stage of life nearest to this afterworld, most influenced by its immanence, is a significant element in Plato's thought. The elderly in Plato's societies were not all rulers or philosophers, nor valued solely for their proximity to the other world, which resembles yet differs from our own. Greek custom revered the old, a tradition Plato feared might fade under democratic emancipation. In the laws, Plato allows choirs of older men to drink more wine than younger participants, so that their songs fully express their wisdom and experience. This practice rationalizes customary permissiveness toward elders and has parallels in other societies. The songs of these older men, enriched by experience, are likely to be more informative than those of the young, justifying Plato's adaptation. This echoes the life of Solon, the great Athenian lawgiver, who in his later years devoted himself to drinking, poetry, and the pursuits of Eros, without losing respect or standing in society. There is no clear general understanding of what the Greeks thought about the approach of death or the nature of the afterlife. Literature contains mythical eschatologies, such as the unsatisfying afterlife in the Nicaea of the Odyssey, which depicts the punishment of notorious offenders against the gods. Most shades, however, are neither happy nor in pain, but exist in a chilly crowd, lacking individuality and unable to communicate. Mystery religions offered the initiated the promise of a pleasurable existence after death, though these claims were sometimes mocked. Tomb epigrams confront death directly or question human identity, origin, and destiny. Death could be seen as a reunion with the earth, the universal womb of mankind, or as a dreamless sleep. Yet more terrible than death itself was the decline of physical strength and social effectiveness that preceded it, the period of separation from the active life of the polis, when children, if loyal, were a primary support, and life resembled the cold loneliness of Homeric shades. For a Greek, as vigor and pleasure waned, even citizenship lost its value, since he could no longer bear arms or participate actively in political life. In this sense, death might not end personal existence entirely, but could extend the separateness of old age. The weaknesses of old age could be comforted by turning to the gods, as old Cephalus does in the Republic. Even gods outside the mystery religions, by virtue of their permanence, sustain the aging individual and reassure him with the symbols of their enduring superhumanity, while also shielding him from unforeseen evils. In the Republic, these protective deities oversee the selection of partners in the temporary marriages of the Phylax. Though their presence may resemble a fossilized rite, Plato nowhere denies their power or existence. Their symbolic authority supports the structured, almost mathematical method behind marital selection. Like Plato's myths, They condense and represent complex realities in accessible symbols, realities that few can fully grasp intellectually and can only appreciate spiritually after long study. Philosophy was not merely a solace for old age, although it was held that maturity was necessary to truly value it. It was not only an intellectual technique, but a condition of the psyche, and it is understandable that only those with long experience of life and reflection could become real philosophers. The phylakes in the Republic are not young, and the nomophylakes of the Laws are explicitly elderly. In Plato's envisioned human condition, a process of metempsychosis accumulates wisdom for society through the rebirth of virtuous souls over a few generations. The perfectly wise and good are eventually removed from the cycle of repeated births, going to dwell in the Isles of the Blessed or becoming daimons. At the beginning of the Republic, Plato presents a man approaching death without philosophy in Plato's sense, yet without the bitter resentment toward death found in some Greek tomb epigraphs. This figure is the old man Cephalus, host to Socrates, Thrasymachus, and Plato's brothers, whose house becomes the setting for the conversations that form the Republic. Cephalus faces the approach of death with the support of traditional worship of the gods, and when leaving the conversation, he performs sacrifices to honor the household deities. One foundation of his agreeable character is his friendship with and devotion to the gods, just as his relations with other people are shaped by the conventional Greek ethic of doing good to friends and harm to enemies. The gods need not be clearly visualized as persons. The sense of their existence as immortal, continuing entities provides the old man with security, even as he recognizes his own personal impermanence. Although Cephalus has withdrawn from daily struggles, he is aware of the hardships that accompany poverty in old age. He himself is prosperous, a successful armorer and foreigner who has thrived in an alien city, allowing him to sympathize with the struggles of survival and remember his own earlier difficulties. He recognizes that even a calm and moderate individual would struggle with poverty-stricken old age. His reflections on the poor elder suggest that he may consider what his own life might have been had fortune been less favorable. Additionally, he appreciates that the intense desires tormenting youth and maturity cool and fade with age. This idea is illustrated in the story of Sophocles, who, when asked in old age if he was still capable of love, replied that he no longer desired it and felt freed from a furious master. Sophocles exemplified well-balanced good nature and conventional piety, representing the type of old-fashioned Greek gentleman Plato admired and would have preferred to see leading the state, if only such men would take up philosophy. Cephalus shares similarities with Sophocles. Both are civilized, resigned, and content, having weathered violent passions in their past and now enjoying calm. There is no suggestion that Cephalus hopes for happiness after death, nor that his devotion to the gods is motivated by such expectations. He is aware of death, but his attitude is centered on human life, contrasting with Socrates, who imagines speaking in Hades with great men of the past. Socrates also considers that death might be a dreamless sleep, a connection between sleep and death common in Greek thought, similar to the Orthodox Jewish belief that morning prayer thanks God for restoring life after the temporary death of sleep. Cephalus' calm withdrawal resembles the Epicurean detachment from practical affairs. It does not foreshadow the studious calm of the Platonic Academy, but reflects the ataraxia, the detached, untroubled calm of Epicurus, developed in an age when the harshness and futility of the old Greek way of life in the polis made action increasingly impossible. Withdrawal from active engagement, the absence of furious passion, and rejection of hope characterize both Epicureans and classical old gentlemen like Cephalus. He does not ask the probing questions that distinguish childhood and philosophical genius from ordinary humanity. He does not confront the questions posed by modern art and philosophy. Where do we come from? Who are we? Where are we going? He is markedly different from the Socrates of the dialogues, who asks radical questions, and from Thrasymachus, the aging sophist, who in the first book of the Republic is shown as more concerned with professional standing than philosophy. Cephalus is an ordinary man who has found a peace Plato does not disapprove of, though fully aware of its limitations. Socrates' mind remained perpetually youthful. He continued to ask the questions characteristic of intelligent childhood and adolescence until his fellow citizens executed him for it. Unlike Cephalus, he did not allow life to run down gently. With a repeatedly rejuvenated curiosity, often distinguishing creative genius, he pursued the questions of his youth unceasingly and with irony, ironically because, as an Iron, he gradually understood that multiple layers of meaning lay between the words of his questions and the elusive, scarcely named realities he sought. He knew that his inquiries were connected ultimately to death, that all human life was a melete Thanatos, a practice of and for the inevitable encounter with that reality, which might be the beginning of a post-mortem existence or a dreamless sleep. In the Apology, Socrates expresses cautious hope for this afterworld, and in other dialogues he describes such realms, yet he presents his hope as little more than a fair expectation. In the Phaedo, he attempts to establish this hope on philosophical reasoning, vigorously opposing the notion that when body and soul separate, the soul ceases to exist and does not continue into other bodies in the future. In the Phaedrus, he acknowledges the difficulty of imagining a place where souls reside after death, emphasizing that human language and understanding are inadequate to describe such another world in spatio-temporal terms. The image of Socrates emerging from middle-period dialogues such as the Phaedo, Republic, and Phaedrus resembles that of the ideal Phylax described in the Republic. Some have suggested that the Republic betrays Socrates, yet here he appears at his most constructive. If the generally accepted dramatic date of the Republic is correct, around 424 years before the Common Era, then Socrates is about 50 years old, a mature philosopher, seemingly fit to rule. His engagement with questions of what constitutes a just man and a just society leads him to envision the society of the Republic. While perhaps unattainable in the world of phenomena, it serves as a guiding ideal for constructing a just society. Socrates, who provoked intense hostility in Athens for refusing to accept customary meanings of words and for asking frightening questions about the gods, was subversive only of the corrupt society of late 5th century Athens. He did not belong to that society, yet the society imagined in his dialogues fits him perfectly. His almost skeptical curiosity, which examines the meanings of what men say, is less emphasized in the Republic, though he examines justice with thoroughness in the opening books. To this critical curiosity, he adds the creative powers of a poet or seer, enabling him to project the image of a new city. The foundation of this new social vision is the individual just citizen, a microcosm of the just society, shaped in accordance with dikaiosine, Greek word for justice. This citizen, even if a Phylax of the golden breed, does not attain complete knowledge of reality, nor is it certain that the society in which he lives is perfectly just. Yet, like Socrates, he is trained to discern truth from falsehood through dialectical analysis, and possesses a social imagination capable of making the society of the Republic credible, perhaps even real. In this way, he is both poet and philosopher. Socrates himself represents the first full citizen of this ideal city, and it is a matter of regret that this combination of creativity and penetrating criticism is ultimately rejected in the Laws. In the Republic, Socrates, as prophet of the world of dead souls, overshadows his role as a critic of language and ideas. In the Apology, he acknowledges that he does not possess detailed or accurate knowledge of the topography of the afterworld. In the Phaedrus, he questions the spatial nature of the hyperuranios topos, the place beyond the heavens, which is the supposed abode of supremely true entities. While the Republic reaches a discouraging conclusion on epistemological matters and raises doubts about whether the polis it describes can be concretely realized, its Socrates does not hesitate to depict Hades in a vivid and horrifying narrative, evoking images reminiscent not of Hieronymus Bosch, but of Dorés illustrations of Milton and Dante. The vividness of these descriptions owes more to Plato than to Socrates, though they may be elaborations of ideas that Socrates adopted from the mystery religions. Like the Phaedo, the Republic portrays the eschatological sufferings of dead sinners, who, it says, pay tenfold for their earthly misdeeds. The Phaedo, however, cautions that its depictions of souls suffering in rivers of fire and similar torments are not to be taken literally. Nonetheless, Both dialogues present their core eschatological concepts in a strikingly detailed manner. Earlier books of the Republic deliberately reject stories of future punishment for the dead, fearing that such tales would provoke base fears in citizens who must face death for the sake of the city. Myth is censored and purified, yet in the 10th book, an eschatological threat is unleashed fully upon the forward-looking individual citizen. Here it is clear that the wicked will suffer after death, while the good will experience pure happiness before being reincarnated into human bodies, a combination of body and soul destined to endure pain in earthly life, even if one is a philosopher. The terrifying eschatologies of the Republic, the Phaedo, and the Phaedrus are not meant to be literal descriptions of the afterlife according to Plato or Socrates. In the Phaedo and the Phaedrus, philosophers are allowed 3 rebirths into the sorrows of this world before attaining peaceful existence in the Isles of the Blessed. These accounts of the afterworld are myths, and there is no requirement to purify them as prescribed in the 3rd book of the Republic. Even the vision of air, one of the most vivid and primitive of these myths, which occupies a significant portion of the 10th book, remains part of an imagined conversation in 5th century Athens, not a direct instruction for the citizens of the ideal city. Nevertheless, the striking contrast between the colorful eschatological threat and the moral refinement of the censored myths in the 3rd book reveals an inconsistency familiar to human experience. Irrational superstition has often coexisted with intellectual subtlety, as among the Pythagoreans. In later centuries, mystical movements such as Rosicrucianism stimulated some scientists, and in all humans there exists an unconscious source of magical thinking and irrationality. Even contemporary scientific theories, though intended to align closely with rational experience, sometimes have myth-like underpinnings. Some concepts, such as the atom, have become so abstracted that they resemble modern myths. The atom remains, however, as an intermediary image that aids our approach to the flowing and far from indivisible reality. It has served a pedagogical and communicative purpose, though it is clear that atoms can no longer be considered the same as those of Leucippus, Democritus, Lucretius, or Dalton. The atom has receded into the mythical past and survives only as a conceptual picture. Demonstration and discovery have displaced it. In a similar way, Plato used the image of Hades and its torments to illustrate what he could not demonstrate. His depictions of infernal realms were visual aids for the nascent science of the good, which he sought to place on a mathematical footing in his famous lecture. Yet he envisaged their eventual supersession. These myths were intended to be provisional, unlike the atom, which ancient and modern thinkers accepted until it was overthrown. By these standards, Plato was neither intellectually nor emotionally dominated by his myths, even though myth is experienced rather than invented. His stories were schematic sketches of reality, adorned like antique maps that personify the winds with puffed cheeks. His poetic talent and stylistic elan have, however, led some to suspect that he believed in the literal reality of these constructs. If he did, it was with the visionary faith of a poet, not the rational commitment of a philosopher. Even so, according to some critics, the eschatological myths represent a notable weakness in his philosophy. They have been described as Swiftian for the sharp absurdity with which they mete out punishment to offenders, and may be read as satirical rather than literal. Plato, like Swift, could channel indignation into his work, yet he consistently elevated the ideal of rational thought and behavior free from hatred. He is said to have remarked to a slave who had erred, "I would punish you, only I feel angry," showing his aversion to actions motivated by raw passion. Though he could write with fiery intensity about other worlds, he did not allow such passions to govern his philosophical aims. Unlike Swift, Plato sought a philosophy in which truth and complex realities were pursued by the philosopher. He was not primarily a satirist of the world as it is, nor a mere theorist of another world, but a constructive reformer of this one. His practical attempts at reform, through figures like Dionysius and Dion, were limited but not disastrously so, and they do not undermine his claim to be more than a utopist or a satirist. The harm of eschatological myth to philosophy and ethics lies in its intrusion on human motivation, introducing a kind of utilitarianism directed toward a supernatural world. If no real harm can come to the good man, and death is merely an interlude before a brilliant afterlife, then it clearly pays to be good. Even when some goods are framed as true and involve suffering on earth for future happiness in Hades or the Isles of the Blessed, the good man still, in effect, pursues his own benefit. Human limitations mean that good is understood primarily in material terms, such as those represented in Plato's myths, even if his esoteric teaching aimed at a more mathematical and refined understanding. Though the individual living being is dissolved at death into body and soul, the liberated soul is held to experience pleasure and pain represented metaphorically in terms of earthly sensations. This reality challenges both Platonists and critics alike and is only refined, not negated, by the Phaedo's idea that the soul carries into the next world only the experience and education it has received in this life. The world of death thus mirrors this world, perhaps more vivid and closer to truth, but is still described in the language of space, time, and sensation. The real world of the Phaedo, as distinct from the phenomenal world below it, is like this world, only brighter and clearer, with forms more fully themselves than the phenomena that depend on them. In short, there is no end to experiences capable of being represented in terms of this world, and they remain comparable to those of earthly life. Death is a passage from the society of this world to the society of another. Freed from the body, the psyche moves into new environments that retain some of the characteristics of earthly society. Its new experiences can be expressed only through corporeal imagery and the vocabulary of the transient terrestrial individual. Life in this world, and in the polis of this world, is oriented toward death. As Socrates said, life is the practice of death, and the psyche carries with it into the post-mortem realm the benefits and defects of the paideia it received during earthly life. The post-mortem environment of the psyche functions like a society, providing reward and punishment, distinguishing between philosopher and depraved, and offering the psyche the choice of reincarnation in a future terrestrial life. This choice depends upon the wisdom or viciousness of the psyche making it. Thus, the world which receives the psyche after death is not final, except for a few psychi who are such philosophers on earth that they are removed from the cycle of birth and death. If philosophical phylakes become daimons, these guardian entities that guide the psyche in its wanderings perform a role analogous to the governors of human society in this world. The post-mortem world, as the myth of Air illustrates, also contains good and bad citizens. Although Plato explicitly states that the human being is, during its earthly life, a compound of soul and body, he treats the psyche detached by death as if it retained the physical characteristics of the soma plus psyche. It is likely that Plato would claim this as an extended metaphor, necessary because of the limitations of human understanding and the poverty of language, and that the psyche embodies the essential characteristics of humanity. Such a view is consistent with what is known of Plato's understanding of the soul and the nature of being. Yet the dramatic rejection of death as the termination of the individual's existence raises the question of whether the psyche truly frees itself from the body at death. Plato, through Socrates, indicates that not all souls completely detach from their earthly envelope when they die. Some remain weighed down by aspects of corporeal nature, continuing in some degree as soma plus psyche, though the exact process by which this occurs is unclear. It suffices to say that some psychi are burdened by their bodily nature. If so, the mortal union of soul and body is, to some degree, capable of surviving after death, and the individual zoon continues for a time beyond earthly life. However, it would be misleading to press this implication too far, since the broader trajectory of Plato's thought seems opposed to it. There is no evidence that he considered a psyche burdened by corporeality to be, in any meaningful sense, the same soma plus psyche that constitutes the human individual in this world. When considering the psyche's carryover of characteristics from this world, and recognizing that its experiences in the next cannot be fully expressed in the language and images of this world, one encounters a profound rejection of death as annihilation. The individual who dies may cease to exist as a zoon, but his individuality endures. The acts and experiences of the individual as a member of society follow him into the society of the next world. Socrates' willingness to die itself embodies a rejection of death, It will not be the end of Socrates. It may be a sleep, it may be conversation with great men of the past. He cannot be certain, but he is firmly hopeful. His death is not the final termination of being, as was the death of the soldiers whose funeral oration was delivered by Pericles. Pericles rendered their deaths socially palatable. Death in defense of the city was glorious, but the dead were gone, and it was the living who were comforted by his words. Socrates' death, by contrast, was inseparable from his citizenship. He obeyed the doubtful verdict of the jurors as if they were as wise as Phylakes, and as if Athens were the ideal city depicted in the Republic. This may represent Socrates' final irony. By dying without attempting to save himself, he demonstrates how political authority and death act as allies. Their power is amplified if, after death, citizenship continues in a new society of the dead, which also has its rewards and punishments. The values of the polis envisioned in the Republic are intended to be universal. The individual belongs both to the polis and to the cosmos. His membership of society, in this sense, is unending. The psyche is a citizen of the universe, marked by the good and bad deeds of the zoon as a member of terrestrial society. It is therefore impossible for the individual, before death, to make a separate peace with the gods, as Cephalus is shown doing. Cephalus, a resident alien in Athens, lived outside both the mystical and political bounds of citizenship. Socrates, the great individualist of Athens, takes his membership in Athens so seriously that he will not escape to another place where he might live outside the polis as a resident alien, like Cephalus. In the contrast between Cephalus and Socrates in the face of death, one can discern Plato's attempt to reconstruct life, society, and death itself. Mere old-fashioned decencies were insufficient for this new vision. The life cycle of the individual has been traced from the pre-embryonic state through death and post-mortem preparation in another world for rebirth. The particulate tendencies in the genetics described in the Timaeus, the fusion of psyche and soma into the human individual, and the supraterrestrial individuality of the psyche in the other world are not entirely compatible, yet perhaps no more inconsistent than other theories concerning human life and the relationship of body and soul. Any theory involving concepts such as body, soul, and immortality tends to invite such tensions, especially when it attempts, even metaphorically, to describe a world beyond this one. According to Plato, the individual recurs, he is born, dies, and is reborn into the world. He is a different individual qua soma plus psyche, since each successive soma is distinct, and the psyche has been altered in some way by its previous earthly existence, having usually undergone purifying or punitive experiences in the other world. Yet the new soma plus psyche is not entirely new. It is in some sense the same individual who previously lived on earth. Pythagoras, in a sense, is the same as Euphorbus or Homer. The psyche carries the human individual out of this world and back again. This cycle of recurrence, along with the brevity of earthly life in which the individual seems to sprout, flower, and wither, lends weight to criticisms of the historicist tendencies in Plato's philosophy of man and society. Plato envisions periods of decline and advance in the human species, and even the society described in the Republic may deteriorate through gradual failures of its genetic and educational philosophy, caused by human error rather than flaws in the fundamental structure of the good society. There is no fully satisfactory response to these criticisms. Plato, like the Greeks generally, was historicist in his outlook on the world and humanity, observing growth and decline as natural facts, just as animal and plant life are defined by the inevitability of death. To reject historicism entirely is to reject the concentrated experience of Greece. Plato's historicism may be tempered by noting that it does not embody rigid determinism in every aspect of human life until the Laws, a late, declined republic, attempts to do so. In the Republic, man is seen as an active individual capable of self-improvement in wisdom across several earthly lives. There are, however, trends toward determinism and rigidity in the Republic, which suggest the possibility of the Republic's evolution into the Laws. Until that point, man is an active participant in society, responsible for his actions. In the Laws, He becomes an active creature constrained by detailed educational conditioning, which allows no room for individual enterprise or protest. The Socratic principle of self-directed inquiry is dead, and Plato, in his old age, is caught by the entropic forces he partially foresaw in the Republic. The laws represent Plato's own individual tragedy. Tragedy dramatizes the fall of an outstanding individual. Setting aside Aristotle's notion of hamartia, the moral implications of a tragic hero's error continue to provoke discussion, as critics protest determinist interpretations of human life. Whatever the hybris of the tragic hero, it demonstrates the paradox of human individuality, the clever, bold, yet feeble and transient anomaly, inevitably doomed, sometimes by his own wit, to destruction. Sophocles, aware that humans come from earth and return to it, celebrated mankind's glorious but futile gifts, noting both achievement and mortality. Plato, the ex-dramatist who criticized drama's social influence with acute logic, was himself the hero of his own tragedy. He sought to reshape human society, but had no model except the societies of his day and the shadowy forms of their primitive predecessors. Over time, the skeletons of these models become ever more visible. The philosophical rigor that Plato built into the education of rulers, intended to prevent them from being primitive or decadent, was gradually eroded by the bitter disappointment of his political ventures in Sicily. Those who attempt the impossible often turn to the rigidly practical. The Republic gave way to the laws. It is not difficult to see that the laws, regulating nearly every aspect of individual life, reflect the work of a man disillusioned by the impossibility of relying on humanity to become wise or good. Plato could risk no more, could offer no further hope or sympathy unless it was secured by legislation. The static character of utopias suggests a certain pessimism, and this view gains support when considering the laws, though one must remember that a pervasive pessimism was already woven into the texture of Greek life. Yet it remains to be asked whether the Republic contains more than this atmospheric pessimism, whether Plato truly believed his ideal city could be realized. Some have argued that Plato did not even imagine that the Republic could be constructed in reality. Yet, in the dialogue, certain expressions by Socrates suggest that when objections were raised regarding practicality, the city momentarily assumes the status of a dream. The notion of dreaming allows the ideal city to be considered without immediate concern for the full revolutionary detail of communal life and extended family groups. The Republic does not consistently frame the city as a dream. Socrates frequently speaks as if the city already exists, delineating its institutions in operation and reasoning backward to show how they function. Occasionally, he acknowledges the provisional character of this discussion with comments akin to, "I had forgotten we were only joking." It is plainly difficult to transform an established society, such as that of 4th century Athens, to the extent of dissolving conventional family ties and substituting a communal sharing of wives and children as described in the 5th book of the Republic. Socrates asks to be granted the same liberties as an interpreter of dreams, building these castles in the air, which, once constructed in words, appear more achievable than when first proposed. Dreams were regarded as expressions of desire in the ancient world, and Socrates, whose personal life was marked by vivid dreams, naturally invoked this realm when contemplating the formidable task of establishing new social institutions. His focus extends beyond political philosophy as knowledge of the merely possible. At the same time, Socrates refers to the city of the Republic as if it were enshrined in the heavens, serving as a paradigma, a perfect example of political and social virtue. Plato's forms are also paradigmata, distant from the mutable and material world. Perhaps he intends the Republic to discuss forms, perfect exemplars of entities concerned with the form of polis. If so, one might identify 3 layers within the dialogue. First, the form of polis implied in passages locating the city in the heavens. Second, the discussion of this city and related themes. And third, the polis treated as if it were an actualized dream, a living social body before Socrates and his interlocutors. This third layer depicts a city subject to human intransigence, enforcing penalties for antisocial behavior, capable of war, and vulnerable to decline if the management of its ruling class fails to produce capable heirs. It is the city that philosophers may govern or kings may found if they embrace philosophy. If considered an imitation of the form of polis, it represents the finest society attainable in this world. Yet the fluidity of the Republic as a whole complicates its reconciliation with the theory of forms. Attempts to rigidly define the city in relation to forms place the dialogue under constraint. Plato does not appear to have intended the status of the Republic to be fixed once and for all, either as a purely ideal entity or as a practically realizable one. By remaining flexible regarding its unattainable aspects, he preserves the capacity to influence actual societies. He imposes no limits upon himself. When reflecting on the ideal city or the ideal polity, or considering that Plato focused his mind on some heavenly form of polis, one confronts the question of whether an ideal city is inherently contradictory. It seems paradoxical if the polis is regarded as ideal, in the sense of something so perfect that it lies beyond human grasp. Though one may strive toward ideals, the implication is that they can never be fully attained, and common sense might counsel restraint. To modern sensibilities, an ideal city resembles a utopia, a nowhere, an eruhon, infused with a touch of satire, sociologically illuminating but impractical as a lived reality. Plato was skeptical of humanity's capacity to grasp absolute truth, yet his forms were not mere concepts of the mind. They were real existence, and in a sense caused the phenomenal objects, which derived whatever reality they possessed from participation in the forms. The Greek conception of perfection was dynamic rather than static. They pursued arete, excellence understood as the active fulfillment of function. Perfection was attainable in striving, though it remained always slightly beyond reach. Plato stressed the transcendent nature of the forms while noting that phenomena strive toward them, seeking to be as real as possible by sharing fully in their respective form. If the polis is a form, it is to be pursued with vigor. The Republic, whether a form or merely resembling one, functions as a discourse directed at the individual. It might become a constitution if, first, children of malleable age were taken from an existing polis and raised under the Republic's principles, or second, if philosophers became kings. From a modern perspective, such a realization is not entirely implausible. History demonstrates rapid institutional growth in newly settled territories, such as frontier America. Books have influenced the formation of societies, from Mormon settlements to the USSR, and book-guided constitutions are therefore not unfamiliar. With anthropological insight, a Platonic fundamentalist could envision something like the Republic's city realized. Huey Long even claimed that his political views closely aligned with Plato's. Scholars have also interpreted Plato's ideal city as akin to a primitive tribal society. Critics such as Popper labeled Plato's social thought totalitarian, though others argue that this view fails to appreciate Plato's individual-oriented concerns. At the heart of the Republic lies a plea for individual renewal, voiced primarily through Socrates. The dialogue advances beyond the personal renewal urged in No Thysoton, proposing that a society shaped in correspondence with human psyche can foster renewal among humans. In this way, man can aid man. Even if the Republic cannot be fully realized in institutions and physical structures, it retains value as a tool of social philosophy. Plato, through his academy and his efforts in Sicily, sought to cultivate individuals who could think philosophically and act politically with philosophical insight. The individual remains a potentially effective agent in the construction and governance of society. Plato's primary address is to the individual. Even if the polis cannot be founded, the individual may still realize himself within it. Plato considered the possibility of using individuals as instruments of his political philosophy. He believed that if a young ruler could be guided by philosophical training, this might serve as a means of achieving politically desirable ends. His efforts to employ individuals such as Dionysius II and Dion were frustrated by the harsh realities of Sicily, a region long marked by disturbance and unrest. The self-serving ambitions and philosophically disappointing paths of other pupils further reinforced his caution regarding vivid, self-seeking individualists, a theme recurring throughout his works. Sicily had long served as the graveyard of many ideals. Plato's shift away from relying on the individual as an effective agent was likely influenced both by his Sicilian experience and by the effects of age and diminishing hope. In the Laws, he designed a society which some have described as an Egyptian caste state, where the individual is treated as a potential threat to social security, carefully constrained so that independent action, considered undesirable, is minimal. While the laws are not utopian, they also do not embody absolute pessimism. Unlike general pessimism, which often disregards the value of ordered life, the lawmakers of the Laws focus intensely on creating an orderly society grounded in understandable motives. Yet, compared to the Republic, the Laws undeniably carry a tone of pessimism. They are practical, concrete, and intentionally designated second best. In contrast, the Republic endures as an anthropological dream, captivating generations with its paradoxes. It is the vision of someone who was not pessimistic about human potential. Although the Republic depicts certain primitive elements of individual human life, this is not a regression toward a hypothetical noble savagery. Instead, it seeks a return to forgotten realities, the simplicity of truth and the intellectually illuminated structure of nature. Absolute truth may be unattainable, and true opinion may be the closest humans can reach through the complex tools of dialectic. Philosophy aims to simplify by revealing the reality and meaning of things without being naive. In the same way, the Republic moves toward simplicity while avoiding naivete. Plato's broad understanding of possible ways of living is scientific rather than simplistic. He seeks to reach reasoned conclusions through the character of Socrates, Athens' most outstanding individual. From the wealth of possibilities available to his imagination, he filters out the best, the most philosophical, and the closest to reality. This represents his study of anthropos, the creature oriented toward higher understanding. The Republic demonstrates how this creature can live best among others of the same species, recognizing that it cannot thrive in isolation.